Hi, my name is James Rigler and I'm an artist. I'm based in Glasgow, and this is a new piece of mine for Aberdeen Art Gallery.
Can you tell us what it's called and how it is made?
This piece is called Tools and Templates, and unlike the work that I've made elsewhere in the museum, this isn't made of ceramics. This is a painting on the wall. It's just made using normal emulsion paint, and it's here quite high up above the stairwell outside the Cowdrey Hall.
You've described it as a mix between painting and drawing. What do you mean by that?
I think drawing is something that's been really important to my work for a long time, but mostly the drawing takes the form of sketching, ideas development in a sketchbook or inside a computer, ideas normally for a 3D piece of work. So this is quite new for me to be working in a way where the two-dimensional work, the drawing or the painting, is the end piece in itself. And it's something that started in lockdown when I wasn't able to get into my studio. I couldn't get access to my materials, to the clay, to the plaster, to the kilns I normally use. And so I was forced back towards other ways of working with other materials that perhaps I'd lost touch with in my day-to-day artistic practice. I'm still kind of figuring out what this is. Although it's made with paint, it feels much closer to a drawing because it's been composed and developed and kind of thought about inside a computer and in a sketchbook, and it was drawn onto the wall when some changes were made in situ, using some big templates as well as sort of measurements to kind of sketch out how it was going to fit into the space. But the paint, I'm not sure whether I'm ready to call myself a painter. I think drawing feels closer to the process that it's been through to get to this point for me.
And have you done any of your painting drawing elsewhere?
Well, so the drawings that I have kind of based this on, these are using a sort of vocabulary of shapes that developed in the drawings that I made during lockdown, so that's 2-3 years ago now. And as I said, those drawings have been slowly feeding into the ceramic work that I make and sculptures using other materials. But recently I've had the chance to work directly onto a wall, which is great for me because I love site-specific or site-responsive installation where you make a piece of work that responds to a particular place, the architecture of the place, the context of the objects that are in the place, how it's used, the history of the building. This is the first time that I've been able to work in such an interesting and kind of rich building and environment. So that's really exciting. I've worked already on a couple of large drawings, I'm calling them drawings now, a couple of large drawings over in Glasgow, which allowed me to see what it felt like to scale these drawings up to sort of room size marks on a wall, which is really exciting because I think I'm probably a frustrated architect. And this is the opportunity to work on a big architectural scale. Working on this kind of scale with ceramics, which is my kind of usual go-to material, is really difficult. It's very, very slow, I think, and cumbersome, and there's lots of waiting around, and you can get some wonderful results, but this feels like a much more quick and intuitive and energetic way of engaging with the space on an architectural scale. So I'm really excited about the possibilities that this offers. Perhaps either continuing as kind of freestanding drawings like this one, or perhaps beginning to work with objects in a room or objects sort of directly in front of or attached to the drawing, like how the 3D and the 2D could start to work together.
So I know you've said, you mentioned about kind of exciting new ways of working, but this new way of working, you've also described it as kind of a more sustainable, environmentally friendly way of working. Could you say a bit more about that?
Because my move back towards drawing was sort of forced on me by circumstance during COVID, I think I'm still figuring out what drawing offers alongside or in the place of ceramics to me. One of the things that I think is really exciting and feels very important is that it's a way of working that's lighter, feels lighter, so it's sort of physically lighter. Drawings can exist with hardly any material. This is a big drawing that's just added 0.0 something millimeters of paint onto the gallery wall, so it hardly exists physically. And that seems exciting and sort of liberating, and perhaps a way of working in the future that doesn't involve the weight of carbon that is needed to fire and transport heavy ceramics, or perhaps just the weight personally, physically, of shifting, lifting, moving half a ton of clay around the studio, working with heavy bags of plaster, assembling big chunky blocks of heavy and breakable ceramics. All of that is a marvellous and exciting way to work, but this feels sort of liberating because it offers a different speed and a different physical engagement with the way of working.
And you've also described this piece here, Tools and Templates, as sort of a prequel or a prologue to primitive forms down below. What do you mean by that?
When I was approached to make primitive forms, which is the installation of ceramic work that's on the floor below the drawing, it was at the point where the art gallery building was just towards the end of this massive redevelopment, which felt very much like a remixing of the building. So taking what was already there, changing it, adding to it, subtracting, making new openings, adding a new floor. And I loved the idea that the building was already doing some of that remixing even before the redevelopment happened. So this was a building that was already kind of sampling from the past of classical architecture, the language of classical decoration. So the sculpture court is pretty much a direct copy of a Renaissance classical building in Italy, and there are pieces of other older classical architecture like the frieze that I think is from the Parthenon, which runs around the top of the sculpture court, which has been sort of put together it's been interpreted by the designers of the museum at some point. So it's not been put together exactly like it was in the original building, it's been put together in a way that fits into the new space that's been created here. So I like the idea that that remixing process was already happening. So when I was thinking about that, I was thinking about, well, what's the earliest part of that timeline that you could draw, that you could sample from? That development of the language of classical architecture. And I like the idea that perhaps if I went far enough back, I was taking from the most ancient, sort of the mists of time, lost in the mists of time, the starting point, the origin of this language of decoration, which no one knows how these languages have developed. So there's a lot of kind of hypothesizing and sort of fairy tale telling, I suppose, about the origins of columns and pediments and carved capitals and decorative features. So thinking about that, I love the idea of making a collection of objects that perhaps were a slightly tongue-in-cheek starting point for the grand architecture you can see in the rest of the museum. So we have a pediment, we have a column, we have an entablature, which is like a frieze running around the room, and then there's a big monumental vase floor as well. So in many ways that felt like a prologue to the story of the museum. This was the what happened first, what happened before, previously in Aberdeen Art Gallery. And I think this drawing on the wall, that's one of the main links with the work that's downstairs. So I think this drawing is also like a kind of prologue, like a first chapter. But rather than a first chapter about the architecture of the building, this instead is about what happens at the start of the making process. So for me, that's drawing and thinking and playing around in the studio and trying things out and making models and maquettes and tools and templates, hence the name of the piece of work. So in some ways, this is a collection of drawings and proposals that could become 3D objects. It's like the very starting point before you start to build something in 3 dimensions. That was a very long-winded reply. Sorry about that.
Really
You can cut and chop that as much as you want.
Or put Julie on the editing front. But I'm also interested in you describing the kind of inspiration from kind of old, what they're called, prints of the
Alchemists,
studio workshop.
I've got to remember why I got into alchemy though. I mean, it's always, well, when I was a kid, I loved books about magic. I think if Harry Potter had been around, I probably would have been a really big fan of Harry Potter at age 8. I think I felt like I was really disappointed when I realised that perhaps magic in the way that we think about it in those fairy tales sort of doesn't exist in the world. And I was really frustrated that wasn't going to be something I could try out when I was a grown-up. And for me, I think making objects is the nearest thing I found to magic in the world. And it sends a shiver down my spine because I think it's something we take for granted because we all do it every day, whether that's making food, making babies, growing things in the garden, building a shelf at home. The idea that humans are capable of imagining something that doesn't exist and then making it exist, and then it's there, it's a magic trick. I think that's incredible and magical and marvellous. And part of that thinking, I think I've been really intrigued by the idea of the history of alchemy, so folk trying to turn base materials, so unprecious materials, into gold, or similar things to that. There are beautiful illustrations of alchemists' workshop from the sort of Renaissance and older. And what I love about them is that there are lots of recognisable objects that are familiar to me from my own studio. So there are containers and boxes and jars and bottles and tools like saws and tweezers and files and sketchbooks and recipe books and all those things that I have around me in my studio now. So when I was thinking about what sort of forms to use here, I like that there's a lot of different, very simple shapes in this drawing that perhaps could imply or could suggest objects that might be really familiar, or they might be really exotic and fancy and antique and ancient and specialist, or they might be things that you have on the shelf in the garage. And I like that's what super simple objects allow you to start making connections. I think might be something that looks architectural, but it also looks like a bar of soap. So I hope in the collection of drawings here, there's a mixture of objects that you might find in my studio, objects that I look to for inspiration, so sort of architectural elements. There are objects that perhaps have been come from those beautiful illustrations of Alchemist's Workshop, and there are kind of domestic things as well. So it's a mixture of all those sort of high and low cultural objects all in the same drawing. One of my tutors, Alison Britton, who was a tutor of mine many years ago, and she talked about how grateful she was to have making in her life because she felt it had been so useful for her mental health, because she thought that making, whatever it is, whether it's a grand piece of sculpture or whether it's making a sandwich, is such an important part of being human that to not have much of that in your life is really hard for lots of people. And I suppose that's something that I think of when I think of that, the magic. It feels sort of interrelated, doesn't it? Like, it's a deep human need to create stuff, and I'm very lucky I get to do lots of that, I think.